and welcome to the Speed of Cyber. My name is Danny Hornigold and I'm delighted to be hosting you through this as we delve into the area of both motor racing and cyber security. Together with George Kurtz and Mike Sentonas, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this rather niche topic area, but one that we've found there seem to be many synergies between and also mutual interest across people from both parties. I've had the privilege myself to work in motor racing for almost 20 years now, and over the past few years I've spent plenty of time with the team at CrowdStrike and began to understand where the synergies lie, but what it has done is generated far more questions for me about the world of cybersecurity. We're going to try and answer some of those in both F1 and securities. I'm joined today by CrowdStrike founder and CEO George Kurtz. George, welcome, and CTO Mike Sentonas. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. A podcast, I say niche, and that's certainly the case, but George, origins for you and the idea around this started some time ago.
It did, yeah. So great to see you, and I'm really excited about this podcast. I'd done a few podcasts in the past, and from other folks, and talked about security and some of the things we do as a public company, as well as I got asked some questions about racing and F1. I think a lot of people realize that there's a racing heritage at CrowdStrike, and they see the logos on the F1 car, and people really wanted more of it. So given what we do and given some of the events that we run with the Formula One team and what we do in the US with SRO and IMSA, we thought it would be great to put the two together. Somebody came up with peanut butter and chocolate, and we thought speed and cyber would be a good topic, and here we are.
Do you know, it's funny, George, because when we first spoke about this last year, and I love the idea of speaking to you guys about both elements of this. Motorsport, obviously I've worked in Formula One now for nearly 20 years, so hopefully I have a good idea around, whereas cyber, I'm admittedly naive, but sort of always open-mouthed in awe when I hear some of the stories. But then we did a CrowdStrike event earlier this year, and I could not believe the amount of customers and prospects that turned up that had sort of that mutual passion. So clearly there's a market for it, and we'll jump in. And talking of mutual passion, Mike, you're very much part of that camp as CTO. Clearly, your background deeply entrenched within cybersecurity, but motor racing wise, a little bit of jet lag for you as not long ago, back from the Australian Grand Prix, where you got a chance to host some CrowdStrike clients, but also get out to the track as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, love the sport, love all motor racing, love all things cars. So yeah, as you said, I was very fortunate to head back home and spend a little bit of time with the family, and then head over to the race and hosted a whole bunch of customers and saw some of the support races. What an incredible event. 430,000 people turned up to Melbourne. After a couple of years of having no F1 in Melbourne, everybody came back strong, and it was a great day. Great racing, great support racing. Customers loved it. We had some GT3 cars that they could have a close look at. Took a few people on some tours and a few surprise visits to meet some drivers. So it was a pretty cool event.
I want to talk back and sort of reflect on the front end of the season in a moment. By the time this podcast drops, we will have been now 4 races into the year. We'll know the outcome of Imola. We're going in a bit blind to that, so we're going to have to guess how things are evolving as we head through the season. But George, one of the things you spoke about in the podcast that you recorded just over a week ago was why CrowdStrike are in motor racing. I think for a lot of people, to be honest, I don't know if it's follow the leader, but there's been a pretty large influx of people from within cybersecurity that have landed within Formula One. I think you led the march, but what was it that, I know you're obviously a racer yourself, George, and a F1 fan, but what was it that led you to F1? Why CrowdStrike partnered with the Mercedes team?
Well, it's an interesting story, and one that probably hasn't been told publicly, but I was working on getting on the Mercedes car probably back in 2010. With a chap that we all know called Zach Brown. Now, Zach was running a company called JMI, if you remember that, right? Before he was running the McLaren team. And we pretty much had a deal done. And that was when Rosberg was there with Schumacher. And it was basically a done deal. We were going to be on the car. And you think about the timing was impeccable, given the run that Mercedes went on. At the time, I was working for McAfee that had acquired my first company, Foundstone. And McAfee got acquired by Intel. So the whole deal fell apart after it got acquired. Intel didn't want to, pay for it. And I thought it was just really a lost opportunity. So it was always a goal to get back into Formula One. We'll talk about why here in a minute, but that's a little bit of the story. We were trying to get on that car early on. And obviously, when I started CrowdStrike in 2011, as a startup, we're focused on getting the product out and scaling the business and those sort of things. And as we grew, we were able to grow into a small relationship with Mercedes-Benz, and that has grown over time. And now we consider ourselves a great partner to Mercedes, and here we are. But that's literally how it started back to 2010, and I was almost on it back then, but now we're on it with CrowdStrike, and we couldn't be happier.
Yeah. You missed out on a couple of championships there, George, but plenty between you already and more to come. We'll talk more, I think, about those synergies later, but let's start on the season. For those that are tuning in and have watched the F1 season so far, as I say, we're chatting here 3 races in. Imola will have taken place now. Difficult year for Mercedes by their very high standards, but maybe a good year for F1 to see the not the red CrowdStrike car that's behind you guys, but the red Scuderia back at the front with Ferrari I think is always good for the sport. Red Bull up there challenging and seeing a bit of a mix up in the pack. What's been your perception of it, Mike? You were out there in Melbourne. What was the general consensus among the fans?
Yeah, I think everyone's loving the racing. I think the whole goal of the changes, and I don't know if we can say it's probably the most radical change to the sport, certainly from a car perspective. And, we're seeing a lot of innovation. You're seeing how the different teams are approaching the aero rules. There's a lot of changes on things like wind tunnel testing time. That's having an interesting, result on how the cars perform on the track. But I think ultimately the goal was always to try to get closer racing, to get the cars overtaking more, to be able to sit behind somebody and not burn up the tires, to again make more interesting racing. We've seen that. We've seen in Bahrain, we've seen certainly in Melbourne, there was some very, very interesting racing. So the fans are loving it. Obviously, there's a little bit of work there that we want to see with Mercedes. I think the team is doing everything. They know how to win, right? So they're going to get there. So it's certainly been a great start to the season, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's been interesting, George. Again, I know years ago I heard you speak back in a former role, and you've been, one of the few Americans, I suppose, at the time that have been waking up at 4 a.m. to watch F1. Now I think all the rest of America, it seems, has woken up to F1 because we go there next year. We'll talk about this later, but 3 races, of course, over in the US next year. It's been a weird one in recent years that we've had the battle with Mercedes and Ferrari back in 17, 18, and then Red Bull joined the fight. But it always seems it's been a 2-horse race at points. And I think if Mercedes can close that gap this year, seeing at least three different teams battle for the championship, suddenly it becomes kind of the ultimate sporting spectacle, I reckon.
Yeah, that's right. And while we have a great partnership with Mercedes, I mean, first and foremost, I think we're myself and Mike are big fans of the sport, right? So, to see some of the other teams do well and just have a variety, I think is good for the sport. And it's really interesting. And I think this year with the new car, it's really shaken things up. And if the ultimate goal is to have just wheel-to-wheel racing, I think they're on a really good path to that, given some of the changes. And lessening up the downforce of the car. And it's just exciting racing, and it's not parades. And I think any number of cars have a chance to win. And, at the end of the day, if you're up front and you've got the right strategy, you've got a shot to win. And, we saw that with Ferrari. Obviously, Mercedes, at the time we're recording this, is second in the Constructors' Championship. And I think given some of the early struggles, I mean, I think that so far that really is fantastic. A lot more to go, and we got a lot of players in there, and I think that really makes it interesting. And when you think about Netflix, and to your point, I was watching Formula One for a long time. Yeah, you used to have to get up early and didn't have all the cloud-based DVRs and those sort of things. Now you can just record it and watch it. But I think Netflix has really done a great job of exposing Formula One to the US in particular. I meet so many fans now that, we're just became fans and mentioned CrowdStrike and just, sort of the dynamic of all these drivers. And I think it's fantastic for the sport.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot tell you the difference in when we first came to the US in sort of modern history, back at Austin a decade ago. The level of knowledge of the average guest 10 years ago compared to now it is night and day. Before, I think if we were coming over from Europe, we had to do our research to make sure we knew our engines, because in the US the knowledge was strong on engines just in general, but of Formula One not so much. Whereas now the knowledge across the board is excellent. There's a fervour and a hunger for F1. Mike, we caught up before we started this podcast yesterday. You and I spoke about it, and there's a few things that have changed this year that I think even someone like yourself, Mike, and maybe even yourself, George, as a racer, you might not be aware of. We know there's this new budget cap, but some of the restrictions that are taking place, and some of the other things, we talked about the new cars and the overtaking, but I don't know if you know, Formula One this year have something at every race where I think it's 5 teams are selected, and on a Friday you have to wheel your car out of the garage, and then you have to tell all of the press what upgrades have been brought to your car. And I think the idea behind it was that where the rules are so restrictive now, they wanted to show where the differences were in the car. People were worried it would look like a stock series, but it's probably something, it's great for the fans, but it's probably something we didn't need, because they've come in all different shapes and sizes this year. The philosophies have been so contrasting. I don't know, as a fan of, it's probably the most fascinated I've ever been, not being an engineer myself, with those differences and trying to understand the different routes people have gone down. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, right? I'm sure if you left it to the teams, they'd love to have some sort of covering, and literally as the clock is about to turn green, the car wheels out and they go, and then they hide it away. But for the fans, it's great. I've been lucky enough, as you know, Danny, to go to a lot of races over the last few years, and visit the garage and have a good look at the car. And even when I was in Melbourne, I was trying to look at the differences, and there's just so much. There's so much that's changed. Even as you say, people at the start of the year thought all the cars were going to look the same. The performance was going to be so different. And I think 3 races in, we've seen a radical difference. And, some of the innovation in the aero, certainly, which is probably where you see most of it, especially the difference between the Mercedes cars and the others. It's actually pretty cool for the fans to be able to see, what are the differences, so they can start to understand a little bit more. So from that perspective, it's been really good. It's nice to learn a little bit more and not just hear about porpoising, which seems to be the only thing that everyone talks about in the sport at the moment. Good to learn about something else that's going on with the cars, that's for sure.
Yeah, George, I don't know. I know you obviously drive the P3, the Ligier, over in the US, and I remember. I mean, again, it's probably 20 years ago when we saw those cars, the flat bottoms that used to suffer porpoising. But as a racing driver, is it something you've ever experienced? Because it looks incredibly uncomfortable. I can't imagine it's easy to have confidence in a car when you're sort of bouncing up and down.
Well, while the P3 has a lot of aero, it certainly doesn't have nearly as much as the F1 car. So we don't experience it in the same capacity. But when you think about bumpy tracks and the balance of the car, you take a place like Sebring, which we were just at, and it's really all about keeping the platform stable. And that's one of the biggest things in driving a high downforce car is to keep a stable flat platform that makes the most grip. And if it's bouncing around, it kind of goes from grip in the front to grip in the back and understeer and oversteer, and it's just really not a fun car to drive. So I can only imagine what these fellows are going through. I mean, he's obviously super talented, top of the world drivers, and you've seen struggles going off the track, spins, those sort of things, which generally don't happen a lot, but I think it gives you an idea how hard the car is and just how much different driving styles you have to get used to. And if you come up in the, through the ranks of the kind of the junior formula up to F1, just the driving style of that car versus a Formula One, and, with all the regenerative braking and the porpoising, there's a lot going on there. And you just have to change your driving style. And what's interesting is I think there are some drivers who can adapt better in those cases than others. And you see that the way they adapt makes someone who maybe wasn't quick in an earlier generation really quick.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Years ago, I interviewed a driver about exactly this, and said, "Is it just the champions fall in line that the car in that era suited their driving style?" And they said no, that the best drivers can find a way of driving the wheels off anything, basically, which I think goes along to your point. But I think what's interesting is, even if we talk about the pace of Ferrari early in the year, or the ability for Mercedes, as we speak currently, to be second in the championship, all of this has been achieved in cars that, to the layman's eye, with that porpoising, even the Ferrari, means the car's probably not working anywhere near optimum. And I think it's gonna, when they finally, which I'm sure, when these cars are sort of unlocked and the mysteries of this porpoising is discovered, I cannot imagine how quick we're gonna be at, you know, think Silverstone, think Austin, these high speed corner circuits. I cannot wait for that moment to unlock. But I think the difficult thing, this budget restriction, the cost cap, I think it fundamentally is good for the sport. I think the big challenge is the budget restriction, is the usage restriction. So I don't know if you guys know, last year the restriction to the World Championship leader or the winner from last year, they had 90% usage of wind tunnel on time compared to the middle of the pack. This year, the team that finished seventh, if they're the 100% team, Mercedes only, for the first 6 months, only gets 70% of that. And then the team that finished last, which is Haas from last year, they get 112%. So there's a 42%, over 42% swing in wind tunnel usage. So you're kind of fighting this recovery with one arm behind your back. And to me, it's not something I think that's sort of, we advertise particularly well, but it's an incredible challenge for the 8-time world champions, the ones they've won with you, for Merck to fight their way back with that restriction. It would maybe be the greatest ever achievement to end up winning Grand Prix this year. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the areas that probably most people don't appreciate. It's not just a driver, it's not just a car, just how much goes into it behind the scenes with the team, and now the cost cap and the testing, and there's so much testing and small nuances to make these cars fast. And if you don't have the time and the money, it makes it really difficult. So it isn't, it isn't, I'll say it in US terms, and I know I'll have an international audience, but the New York Yankees, not like they just show up with an unlimited, dollars in the old days and just win, right? You can't do that. And it's the same here. So yeah, I don't know, Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot going on, sort of along that lines. A lot of people don't realize, we were talking about this with some of our guests in Melbourne, that at the start of this year, a lot of the teams, well, all the teams started off with the same blank canvas. The FIA put the specs out to the car. Everybody starts with that blank canvas. And then to try to build that parity into the sport, as you said, the lower ranked teams got more wind tunnel testing time. And we're seeing that, right? You're seeing a team like Ferrari that has, such a strong, rich history in the sport. They were always going to be successful. Plus they had the benefit of having additional time on the car. And I think that will even out over the season. I think you don't forget how to build a fast car. You've seen a lot of different things come into play. George, I think you mentioned that Mercedes is second in the championship. Things like reliability is a big thing. You get 3 engines a season. So right. You can't come out and just wind the engine up as hard as you go.
You can. We saw what happens.
Well, we know what happens, and we know how that ends. But you got to make it last the season. But also, look at Melbourne, right? You've got the heaviest cars I think ever. They're getting close to 1,000 kilos. How fast were they on the track? I had the opportunity to watch them come out of, I think it was turn 10. It's mind blowing to see them come out of the corner. I mean, it's always amazing, but they've got so much downforce. The speed that they carry through the corners is just incredible.
Yeah, I think jumping in there, actually, talking about the weight of the cars, I think the last 10 years of my F1 career, I've spent appealing for a night race down the strip in Vegas, and somehow, somewhere, I've said it to enough people, it's manifested and it's going to happen. And I think my new thing is going to be the ban of the weight limit in Formula One. Mike, you're saying nearly a ton. The last time Grand Prix cars were this heavy was 1934, with the first Silver Arrow that came about, the first Mercedes Silver Arrow that came about, because the car was overweight and they allegedly sanded the paint off to get down to it. And we're now with fuel over 900 kilos and we've got a weight limit. But I don't know why we need it, because there's a budget cap, so you can't spend on exotic materials. The safety, you can't cut the safety out because you're tested for that. I think it gives another development avenue, and so you've got to kind of pick your pot of where you put your money and resources.
I think this is why tech people love the sport. This is why I love the sport, because the innovation is just incredible. All of the work that goes into just unlocking a tenth of a second, and a tenth of a second over a season, over a race, makes a difference to being in the points, being out of the points. You meet tech people, and within a few minutes, they're like, "Oh, I love Formula One. Oh, what do you love Formula One?" Well, I love the racing, but I love the innovation. I love to see what they do. I love to see what the teams come up with. And I think we're going to see that this season. You're going to see 8-time constructors champion look at the adversity of kind of what they've gone through for the first 3 races. We'll see how they innovate, and we'll see what they come up with. And I don't think it'll be that long before you'll see Lewis at the front of the pack. And, he's had a great start to the year with some challenges in the car, and we'll see that continue.
Yeah, and Fernando Alonso looked quick for much of until he had the hydraulic problem in Melbourne. Nice to see him and Alpine up there.
He's always quick. He's always quick. That's a guy you just don't want to be behind.
Do you know, it's interesting with Fernando, because having stepped away from the sport for a couple of years, I remember a former driver once said to me, elite level sport is like a balloon. Once you put a small hole in it, i.e. once you step away and your mindset takes you away from it, it doesn't matter how much air you put back in that balloon, you can never pump it back up to 100% again. And with Fernando, it seems to be almost the only case. It just doesn't seem true. He seems as good as ever almost. And the fact that when you see him crash in Melbourne, your first instinct, even in these cars that are obviously hard to drive, your first instinct is, it's probably a mechanical, it's probably not Fernando. And it was, just shows the level he's at.
Yeah, I would agree. We got to work with him a bit. I think it was 2018 or 19 when he did the Rolex 24 hours. And
yeah,
the guy just got in a car, and I mean, he's driven a whole bunch of different things over the years, but it's just, amazing, right? What he was able to do and how fast he gets up to speed. And I think he is one of those drivers where you just go, yeah, he doesn't crash. Something happened with the car. And he's that good. So it's exciting that he's back in the sport. Sometimes not so great if your team is behind him, because he drives pretty wide. But
yeah.
That's a fierce competitor right there.
But I don't think you forget to drive, right? Sorry to cut you off, Danny. I mean, you know Mario better than I do, George, but having the opportunity to sit in the car with Mario Andretti, I mean, when did he win his world championship? 78, 79, I think 78.
Mike is pretty good.
He's so fast in a car. Like if I could do a fraction of what he does in a car at his age today, you don't forget how to drive.
So he still does 200 miles an hour in the dual seater Indy, at the Indy 500 when he takes people around. And his car has a little something extra. Of course, it's Mario's car than the other ride along cars. And the guy can wheel, he can wheel it. So I think Mike's right. When you look at these elite pro drivers, they don't forget how to drive. And the hard part is you've got a lot of young drivers who have come up, done a lot of simulator work, obviously go-karting and all the way up through the ranks. But I think the simulator work for the younger drivers has made a real big difference in terms of just their cognitive ability to do so many things at once, and just, be able to take in so much information more than some of the older drivers. So I think that's the harder part for some of the older fellows out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty good example. When you give him Mario Andretti as an example, he was voted driver of the century, so it's hard to knock him. But it reminds me of a story going back to, we mentioned porpoising earlier on. And the last time we really saw it in Formula One was back at the start of the 1980s with the ground effect cars. And you may remember or have seen documentaries that they banned the movable skirts, so the skirts that would drop to the ground to seal the tunnels. And when they banned them, they realized, okay, we can lock the car out and literally take the suspension out of the car is the best way of stopping that porpoising. And poor Mario came back, and I think it was 1982, he did one race to step into a Williams at Long Beach. And you can imagine, if you've never driven a car of that nature and the suspension's locked out, it's not an easy one to come to terms with, even for the great Mario. But remember, at the time, we were talking about, as a driver, how that feels, George, and the weight distribution and the balance, that center of pressure, the center of gravity moving around because of that. Ultimately, as long as the car's quick, it doesn't matter how the driver feels. And there's a lovely quote from that era with Alan Jones, who is, of course, the 1980 world champion for Williams. And they decided to lock this suspension out. Alan did a lap in the car for Williams, came back into the pit lane. Frank Williams came over and said, look, how is it? And Alan said, it's a nightmare. I can't see. The car's bouncing around. Until I slow down, I can't see anything. And Frank said, but how quick is it? He said, well, it's quicker. And Frank said, well, you've got to drive it then. Alan said, well, I might need some suspension in my seat. And Frank said, well, sit on your wallet. And Alan Jones said, well, give me something to put in it then. So just a wonderful relationship between the team principal and the driver from a bygone era. But the idea that ultimately driver comfort is relatively low down on the order, as long as they can roughly see and are going quickly. It's the stopwatch that tells the story and makes the decisions, I guess.
That's pretty much it. If you're a pro driver, you got to drive what you have and make it better. And that's why you get paid the big bucks. So that's what a lot of these young fellas have to do, and gals as well, across all different racing series. And, at the end of the day, like we said earlier, it's the folks who can get the most out of whatever they bring are really the special drivers.
Let's talk about that, about different cars and racing them. You mentioned earlier that Mario, back in the day, he won in basically everything. He would jump in everything. Even across a weekend, people would race it in Formula One. They'd go off and do certainly back in the 50s and 60s, they'd do F2 as it was. It's a shame we don't see that, I guess, anymore. It's not very realistic with the modern demands. But of course, George, you're racing in other series currently. I want to touch on that a little bit, of just what it's like as someone who's come through as a lifelong racing fan, but is now out there in GT America, winning races, stepping up on the podium and jumping in some pretty incredible cars.
Well, yeah, it's been great. It's been quite a journey, and I've driven a whole bunch of cars. I didn't start go-karting when I was young, so you've got a lot to do and a lot of work to put in to keep up with some of the younger folks out there. But at the end of the day, I think, getting back to what we're saying, the people who can really get the most out of the cars that they drive are going to be at the top step of the podium. And, I've been fortunate enough to run with Colin Brown, who's my co-driver in IMSA and in SRO. And, he's one of those guys that can pretty much jump into anything and be fast. And I've seen it, just like good car, bad car. We don't always have the best car, and he's still fast. And if he's not, there's generally something wrong with the car, or the setup or something along those lines. So I've seen folks like him. How he's not in Indy, I don't know. He should be, but even other guys like Colton Herta, I actually got to do an 8-hour race with him and his dad, which was pretty cool. We did that in Laguna Seca, and this was before he was in Indy. So I have our winning picture together because we won that race, and that's before he was a big shot. Maybe, hopefully, we'll have a shot here in Formula One. But he's another guy that can drive anything. Doesn't matter, loose, pushy, just drives the wheels off it. And I guess, long story short, if you can get good in multiple cars, there's a lot of guys that are good in one make. I think the real champions stand out in being able to be fast in just about anything they drive.
I want to talk, because Mike, I know race fan, but it's time for you to get your race license. Have you? Is that underway, Mike? Are you going to give that a go? Make sure you get out there and get wheel to wheel and see how you can interpret that into the boardroom as well as out on track.
No, you won't see me going wheel to wheel. I'll, leave that to George. If I can work out some way of convincing him to let me get behind the wheel of a GT3 car, that would be good. But
it's different.
Yeah. Oh, look, I might get the license just to be a better driver and just have a little bit more of an appreciation. But it's certainly, there's no intent to get behind a wheel or anything. But had the opportunity to do a few laps with AMG out at Laguna Seca recently, and interestingly enough, you know, one of the things that I really took away, and George and I were talking about this, I see George do these customer events where he's literally suited up. He's got his helmet in his hand. He's about to drive the car. There's customers talking to him. There's the team talking to him. We've got staff at these events, and then he gets in the car and first lap he's on. The thing that I really took away from spending time at Laguna Seca was it's hard. I can't imagine how you see Lewis and George Russell and all the other F1 drivers, how they have the ability to just turn off. They're in the circus that's Formula One just before the cars go, and they're just on it straight away. It's an incredible talent. It took me several laps to get to a point where I was comfortable in the car, and then you get out and then you're dealing with all of it. I like doing it because it gives me a little of a window into what's going on.
I think that the biggest thing for me is, if you've done even a medium length circuit, trying not to make a mistake on a lap that ruins your lap completely is nigh on impossible if you're not a brilliant driver. So I know, George, I think one of your favourites is Spa, but for any mere mortal as a racer, I think 7 kilometres is too much without making a mistake. So I prefer the shorter tracks, less corners, less to get wrong.
Well, I guess what we have to talk about, though, is that every lap there are mistakes, right? Whether it's Lewis Hamilton or guys like myself or anybody in between, right? And there's big mistakes and there's little mistakes, but a lot of times what you don't see the little mistakes by the best drivers, right? All the pro drivers, like, they're little mistakes that they make, and at the end of the day, they just sort of correct for it and move on. And the little mistakes don't turn into big mistakes. The big ones are when you're off the track or you just lose a whole bunch of time. And I think that's really important. And, they know how to save the car. They can go fast. And it's just sort of these little micro kind of mistakes that they move through. But when you're on a track like Spa, which we're excited to go back to this year for the 24-hour race, the conditions are crazy. You think about racing in the rain and at night and in the fog. And for whatever reason, when I'm there, I always seem to get the night shift in the rain, when all the pro guys are sleeping. So it is difficult. It's a lot of fun. They did some recontouring there, I think, of the runoff areas, which you probably saw.
Yeah.
So we'll see how that changes things. But yeah, I mean, some of these tracks are amazing in Europe, and it's just pretty special to be able to drive some fast cars like a GT3 on them, which is a handful of folks that get to drive these cars. Certainly, more than a Formula One, but man, they are just amazing cars if you get in them. Like, it's unbelievable what they can do.
I said I was going to ask naive questions about cybersecurity, but I guess I'm asking from a fanboy perspective and understanding. And I've been thinking about this while we've been talking. Say, Mike, you are over in Melbourne, and obviously you've got, we're used to data traveling around the world now. It's something that I think for just your standard user, you're comfortable with. But for an F1 team, I suppose, like a lot of businesses, they can't afford any latency. So from Melbourne, 7 of the 10 teams are in the UK, 2 are in Italy, 1's in Switzerland. That data's got to make its way around the world. How much of a consideration have the teams got to put into sort of protecting that, encrypting it in some way, in order that their $140 million budget cap that they're using so carefully this year to improve the cars isn't intercepted, shall we say?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there's a lot of roads you can go down on that topic. I mean, there's so much money in the sport. There's so much innovation. There's opportunity for this data to go to the wrong hands. You've got staff across the teams that change, and people don't want to make sure that they want to protect their IP. But there's little things, the availability of all the systems. You can't just turn up today in a modern F1 car and drive it and win the race. You rely on data, you rely on the team, you rely on the availability of all of these systems. So like a normal organization that has to keep their organization free from things like ransomware, the F1 teams have to do the same things. Again, there's other synergies, right? Businesses today, they can't have security slow down their systems. So even though they need to stay safe and secure, if you're an online retailer and you're in the week leading up to Christmas, security can't slow down your ability to process orders and make transactions. I don't think we can go to Chauv and Mercedes and say, hey, we're going to protect all the engineering work that you do, but you're going to lose 30% of your performance because we're going to slow things down. Yeah. You're not going to have a chance in that environment. So you have to give the teams maximum protection, but you need to give them their ability to do what they're there to do, and that's to win races.
CrowdStrike, you talk about every second counts, and fairly obviously there's a natural synergy to motor racing. Every thousandth of a second and even more can count. But one of the things that reading recently, and I was going to say competitors, but maybe I say pretenders to the crown, easy mud to be thrown at CrowdStrike. People have, I think, tried to use the 1-10-60 to make the process and that sort of ethos or philosophy, if you like, the CrowdStrike put into play, to seem a very human process. And I want to just understand a little bit about that, because in Formula One, if I think of a strategist, Mike, you're talking about simulation, the top strategists, they will run millions, literally millions of Monte Carlo simulations and race strategy simulations from after qualifying on a Saturday to prior to the race Sunday. Almost every conceivable outcome is analysed. But when it comes to race day, they don't let the computers just make the decision. There is a very human, a racer's instinct that is part of that, and it's that blend of man and machine. And I want to talk about 1-10-60 and the idea that is there latency because of human beings, and actually what is that like in reality for you guys at CrowdStrike? I wonder if it compares to that racer's ethos in Formula One blended with high tech.
Yeah, you made an interesting comment there about every second counts. It's one of the things that we talk about in cyber. One of the reasons why we love partnering with Mercedes and being part of the F1 sport, because in cybersecurity, literally every second counts. The longer it takes you to detect somebody on your network, the longer it takes you to remove them, the harder it's going to be ultimately to keep your organization safe and secure. And the interesting thing is, we're not at a stage, we're not in an era where the computers can deal with the problem themselves. We heavily rely on artificial intelligence to prevent malicious software from running. But a lot of the attacks that we see, they're attackers, they're adversaries that use stolen passwords, they use stolen credentials, they use misconfigurations, they use vulnerabilities in Microsoft operating systems or applications most commonly. And once they get in, they're not using malicious software. This is the part that I think a lot of people sometimes don't necessarily realize. They will get on, they will act like you. So if I've got your username and password, Danny, and I'm hunting around the network making changes, it's hard for somebody to work out, is it me from the US or is it you from the UK? And that's one of the reasons why we talk so much about the partnership between the technology and the people, the human element, the hunters. The faster that you can detect these things on your network, the faster you can work out what's going on and the faster you can recover. And as you said, a lot of people have come in and, 1-10-60 is too slow, or other people have said, you can do it all autonomously. I don't buy into the marketing or the hype. Our job is to keep people safe and secure. Our job is to keep our customers protected. That's why we say we stop breaches. And we use innovation, we use technology, but we use that human element to make those decisions in real time. You can't take that out. I'm sure it's similar in the F1 team. The computers aren't telling you when to box. They're not telling you, everything. There's an element of that experience, of that intuition, and that all has to come in together to be successful.
It's interesting when you talk about cars and autonomous driving. There's 5 levels of autonomous driving. Most cars are at level 2, right? You take a Tesla, which I love, right? I think they're great cars, and I love Mercedes, and I love a lot of other cars that are out there. I'm a car fan. That's level 2. Like, could you drive any of these cars, or could the car drive itself with you not in it? Answer is no, right? In today's day and age, no. And I think it kind of gets back to what Mike is saying. Like, you can wrap all the marketing hype you want around it, but at the end of the day, there's a level of decision making, just like why is Toto on the in the garage, right? At the end of the day, he's taking all this information. You want to automate as much as you can, but you got to make a decision and go with it. And I think that's really important. And when you think about things like 11060 that we talk about, to be able to actually, remediate something, we're talking about non-malware related attacks, finding an attacker within a minute, understanding what's going on in 10 and basically remediating that within 60. That's like Herculean. Like there's nobody does that in this industry. And that's much different than being able to detect a piece of malware in 100 milliseconds, which we can do. That's not a big deal. So I think just kind of like racing in Formula One, you've got a lot of players that are out there. Some players, do a lot of talking, and other players let the results and the scoreboard speak for them.
Yeah, I think that's it. Ultimately, you can use a great marketing line or campaign, and you can talk a great game in testing pre-season in F1. But once the lights go out and the stopwatch starts, you better make sure you're quick and you're delivering on what you've said you can do. I want to change tack slightly and to talk about a bit of the current news in the world of cybersecurity and again, talk about baptism by fire and my increasing learning. I've been obviously over a number of years now, known you guys and enjoyed your company, and we've talked motor racing, and I've been fascinated by the world of cyber, but I didn't think I'd be in a position. I was flying back from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix and watching the sci-fi movie Dune on the plane, and the this planet Arrakis, and this at that point the sandworm was the big scary thing in the film, and then now I suddenly realise there's a much scarier sandworm. There's not a worm in a film, but in actual fact is a player in the world of cybersecurity. I think probably 6-7 years ago now, sort of first surfaced in Ukraine as a threat to them, but again has reared its head more recently. I think there's an ease to be naive about that. I'd love to know the background a little bit on the sandworm, the group, and what's been happening of late.
Ben and George, I'm sure make some comments as we go there. We actually refer to sandworm as the group as Voodoo Bear, so that's the naming convention that we use for that particular group. They've certainly come into their own of late with the horrible situation going on over in the Ukraine. CERT advised, I think it was 12th of April, that they've found an attack on the Ukrainian energy sector. And focusing on a couple of facilities that operate a high voltage electrical substation. And the adversary was using two phases to the attack, but the one that's I think most important to talk about was an element of destructive capability, and that initial compromise started in February this year, and then we saw that this got a little bit more serious in early April. So this is not an unusual thing to see. George and I have been doing this for a while. We go way back. We've seen a lot of attacks, and this concept of destructive attacks has become more and more common. We're well beyond the days where you saw malware for notoriety, or you did it to be a little bit cheeky to disrupt systems. We're now seeing examples of destructive attacks, and if you look at what's going on with the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the invasion of the Ukraine, we're seeing examples like destructive wipers, things designed to cause service outage, service disruption, instability, which is a concern. And that's one of the things that we're actively protecting organizations around the world from, including in the Ukraine, and something that we're keeping an eye on very closely.
And Mike, I talk about this all the time, these wipers and their nature of how they destroy systems. That may not be known what a wiper malware is. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, so in a simple explanation, it's when a malicious application runs on the system and literally renders it inoperable. And that can happen in a number of different ways. But, we've seen examples of attacks where machines were wiped out, and the user tries to reboot the machine and there's no ability to reboot. There's wipering attacks that delete data and all the critical systems. But effectively, you're looking at literally making the system inoperable. Now, if you think of this example, Danny, where you started off talking about Voodoo Bear, that's a scary situation if you attack an electrical substation. There's obviously an issue if it causes, massive damage locally, but also you can imagine what's going on over there in the Ukraine. If people don't have access to power, if they don't have access to the critical infrastructure, if they don't have access to get money. I mean, you can keep talking about these examples. Not only are they dealing with what's going on, which is a horrible situation, but there's a real psychological campaign and part of this as well. And we've seen that play out in the lead up to the actual invasion, which is devastating.
Continuing on that, talking, so there've been attacks on ISPs as well, and I guess even that level of communication at a time, that segregation of infrastructure and the ability to communicate is so huge. You talked, Mike, you teed me up perfectly by referencing Voodoo Bear in terms of correcting my analogy and how you describe the adversary. And I want to look at that. I was somewhere on the CrowdStrike website the other day and looking at the speed of movement of different adversaries and the level of aggression at which I guess I think about cyber hackers or people operating in that world as being almost ninja-like, moving stealthily, whereas looking at the times and the way that Voodoo Bear seems to move, it's more like someone walking up and kicking the doors down. Is that even more of a that reference to every second counts even more critical when someone's moving of that nature?
Well, I think this shows a little bit of our age. When I started off, all I've ever done is cyber. And if I look at the start of my career, if there was an attack in London, you had 6 months to deal with it in the US or in Australia, as an example, where I was based. And even then, people struggled. Today, if there's an attack in Sydney, there's an attack in New York, there's an attack in London, they may happen within split seconds. So your reference to speed is an interesting one, Danny, because a few years ago, we went through the process of really starting to benchmark these groups, these adversaries. If you're an organization that's targeted by a group that's affiliated with Russia or a group that's affiliated with North Korea, China, and so on, how long does it take them to find a way in? How long does it take them to find the opportunity to create a beachhead and then to start moving laterally within an organization? You'd be blown away. I mean, we saw groups that are affiliated with Russia taking less than 19 minutes. That's why we say every second counts. The time it takes them to find a misconfiguration, to use those credentials that they steal or they buy, as an example, to find a system, to get onto that system, to give themselves the privileges and the ability to start moving laterally. Less than 19 minutes. This is why George talked about, 11060. For an organization to implement that is a Herculean effort, because that's what you're dealing with today. You're not dealing with a situation where an adversary takes days, weeks, months. They may be preparing. And I think that's, not to sort of segue too much, but, a lot of people talk about Russia and we haven't seen this massive attack with what's going on in the Ukraine. There's a preparation phase that does go on. And when they go hard. And I think we've got an opportunity now. Every organization has the time to do something about it. That's why the US government talks about shields up. Do something about it now. It's really hard to deal with a cyber attack when it's going on in your network.
Mike, there's an analogy back to Formula One when we think about identity and the credential system in Formula One. You just came back from Australia. How hard it is actually move between the paddock and other areas. I mean, of any of the race series I've ever been involved in, you can't move anywhere without the right credentials, right? Coming and going. And I think that's an area of identity that is probably not well understood in security in terms of, how you can actually implement it and how important it is to stopping breaches. 62% of the breaches that are tracked, and this is in our threat report, are not malware related. And a lot of them take advantage of identity abuse as well as vulnerabilities. And it just, it goes hand in hand with being able to control who has access to what. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, you covered it, right? It's one of the things that we try to help people understand is you're going to face lots of different adversaries. You're going to face lots of different attacks. to stop breaches, to keep your organization safe and secure, you need to make sure that you can cover all of them. This is where the relationship's really unbalanced. And this is one of the things that we always talk about. As an attacker, you have to find one way in. As a defender, you need to find all of the holes and make sure that anyone walking through any of them, you've got the skills and the technique and the processes to be able to protect against all of them. That's the kind of why this is such an unbalanced relationship. You know, George and I did some work together preparing for a presentation last year at an event as part of a Hacking Exposed series. And the idea that we had was to talk about identity and identity-based attacks. And, you know, it's really interesting, you know, you asked about Voodoo Bear, Sandworm. There's a group called MITRE, Danny, a government organization. They evaluate vendor technology, and great timing, fortuitous timing. They used the tradecraft from Voodoo Bear. And I find it an interesting story because when they evaluate your product, they use the techniques of this adversary to measure your effectiveness, your ability to stop them. And the attack starts with identity that George has touched on. And we were able to stop that attack using our identity technology that's integrated into our platform. And the reason why I say it's an interesting story is the evaluator had to contact us and say, can you turn off this capability in your product? Because we can't do the test. We can't carry out the evaluation until you turn off that capability. And to me, the rest is kind of not irrelevant, but that's what we're there to do, right? To create the different levels, the different techniques. No one technique is going to stop every attacker. And it's the platform approach of trying to do as much as you possibly can, and the technology working together that gives you the outcome, which is stopping breaches.
One of the other guys from F1 was asking me earlier, actually saying, look, the CrowdStrike, they've obviously got the legacy information that lives within the business, so the data that's stored and the knowledge that has been built, that archive of information that's been built over years. But in Formula One, past success is no guarantee of future success. And so in F1, you don't turn up at a race. We don't go to Miami and just focus on there. The team is already working and designing and developing the 2023 car. There's already people thinking about the 2026 set of regulations. What can you do? What do you do if you're trying to protect people in either, I guess, coming up with ideas of what an attack might look like outside of what you know, so that kind of idea of blue sky thinking, but also trying to get someone to permeate that protective Falcon umbrella to know where any weaknesses might be?
Well, we spent a lot of time on that, and as you might guess, we see a lot of attacks all over the globe, and there's different techniques, but a lot of the attacks follow a similar kind of pattern, if you will, right? So we spend a lot of time training the AI algorithms with the right amount of information. Just like a Formula One team, you're capturing so much information, and we've got 10 years of data that we comb through, and we learn, just like the Formula One teams learn back. You know, you were talking about the early 80s with some of the ground effects cars. Well, they learned something from that, right? That they're going to take and apply here. Different era, different time, different technologies. We get it, but there's similarities. So I think that's a big part of security space and things that we do here at CrowdStrike. And again, this isn't a CrowdStrike, podcast. We're talking about security in general and obviously speed and cars, which is the main theme. But in security, having the most relevant data and a history of that is really important so that you can get the best outcomes. And, that's what we focused on. And there's, we've had good success being able to do that and organize in a way that makes sense.
I've got another question that I've been thinking about, because what I love about the CrowdStrike adversaries, and again, talking about security in general, is the way of identifying who that adversary is. But in my head, I think to some degree, I almost make that sort of James Bond, the Bondian villain to some degree of these characters. And when we think about whether it's North Korea or Russia, for example, and Iran with the state-backed attackers, I want to know the other side of the coin, because, of course, in James Bond, you've got someone from the UK or from the USA who's ready to protect and serve in that regard. And I just wonder, Is the same thing happening in the opposite direction? How does it look from these countries? What does the preparation look like? I've got no idea whether there's this bank of people waiting, ready to go, with I guess that counter threat that you would use in physical warfare. Does that exist in the cyber world?
It does, and you have to realize that every nation state, no, I shouldn't say every, the bigger, more sophisticated ones have these capabilities, defense and offense, including the U.S. And there are differences in how countries operate. So if you take China as an example, which are, we call pandas. So we came up with this naming convention so we can figure out who's who, in the zoo, I guess, no pun intended. You've got bears and pandas and different groups, and that's how we name them. That's probably a topic for a different day. But if you look at something like China, China has no problem in breaking into a company and for reconnaissance and information and intelligence purposes, they'll break in, but then they'll take the trade secrets and give it to companies in China. That doesn't happen in the U.S., right? The U.S. has amazing cyber capabilities, but they're not breaking into one company, taking trade secrets and giving it to a U.S. company. It just doesn't happen that way. So it's a really interesting field because there's different standards and norms of how they operate in cyber, just like how we've seen in the physical world. And it's pretty tragic what's going on in today's environment geopolitically. So it's something that, by understanding how the adversaries work, it's a way for you and corporations to be able to protect themselves. If you know where they're strong and what they're focused on, you can provide defenses around that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I just wonder whether, as I say, that deterrent, whether there's an attack waiting in the wings, because as we say, if practice makes perfect, I don't know, you've got to be being preparing at all times, I guess.
But here's, and you might imagine with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we've gotten a lot of questions around this, and you've got to think about this, in terms of physical versus cyber, right? In the physical world, you look at javelins, right, taking out tanks. You're not going to change a javelin anytime soon. You're not going to change those tanks anytime soon, right? In the cyber world, once you use that cyber weapon, it's a one-time use. Everybody knows what it is, and then you kind of patch and mitigate against it, right? So you'll look at different levels of escalation, but suffice to say, most governments have access to something at all times, and they also have the ability to destroy things at all times, and it depends on how and when they want to use it.
I've got so many more questions. I think it'll have to wait for another day because we're already time is already running short. But yeah, I'll go away and continue my research and prepare for the next time because a million questions.
Well, let's I mean, as we wrap up here, let's talk a little bit about Imola because we're going to see you there. We've got some business in Europe, so we're going to spin over there, say hello, and then continue on. What are your thoughts?
It's difficult because by the time this comes out, it will have happened, and so you've got to make a prediction, which is never easy in Formula One. But I think the big thing for me in Imola is the sprint race, and your feeling on a sprint race is important. I think the perspective of the weekend is we've got 3 sprint races in Formula One this year, and again, for those who don't watch regularly, they were brought in to, I guess, elevate the highlight of the weekend. So we will now qualify on a Friday afternoon. We will then have a sprint race, which will decide the Sunday's grid effectively. But there's also points this year for the top 10. And for me, I'm not a fan, and this may be a conversation for another day. I think it's the Grand Prix, it's the Grand Prize. All the other series can have little races that go around them. My concern with the sprint race is always, people talk about there not being enough overtaking in Formula One, but as soon as you have qualifying in a motor race, the likelihood is the fastest car will start at the front and the slowest at the back. So why is anyone surprised that after the race, the fastest car wins and the slowest car's at the back? And I think the benefit of the current qualifying is that there is jeopardy. You might get knocked out in Q2, so you start out of position, and that makes the race more interesting. What the sprint format does for me is it takes a bit of that out. You can make a mistake in qualifying, and you can then rectify it, and so the pack reshuffles, as it were, as it would be. But I think, to answer your question, George, really, Imola, brilliant to be back there. I've heard a lot of rumours this week leading up to it about teams bringing upgrade packages, particularly in terms of weight saving. So a lot of the teams are running overweight at the moment, or are not able to run certain elements because of weight. And so I think that will be very notable and essential as we get into this phase of the season. And I think the great to be back at a legacy circuit. I think the other big question is when those updates come. We mentioned a game we could spend a long time on it, but with a $140 million budget cap, and people may laugh at this, but how do you build 2 F1 cars for that? It's an expensive sport, and the reality is a large part of that $140 million is your infrastructure. Just the personnel that you have and physically building that first car takes up a big chunk of that. So your decision on when you commit to what's being engineered in compute, when you make the physical version of that, before you'd make everything. Now, when you pick to make that as a package and put it on the car, I think you'll see that pecking order change much more than we've ever seen before. So because of that, I'm going to be a coward and I'm not going to predict anything. What do you guys think?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the areas that we should focus on in a future podcast is just the cost per tenth. And in some series, it's the cost per second. In Formula One, it probably is even more granular than that, but per tenth. And maybe we'll bring some other guests on here to talk about what that looks like, because just getting a tenth out of a car, there's a cost to it, and I think it would be fascinating to explore that a little bit. So maybe we can put that on the docket. But in general, yeah, I don't have any expectations. Obviously, as a fan, I think there's going to be a lot of overtaking on a pretty historic track, and we saw a lot of fireworks last year in that race. So, we'll see how it goes. But I think with the new regulations and the overtaking, it's going to be pretty exciting.
Mike, you gonna make a prediction or not?
I think I got the order of Melbourne right. I got one of the drivers wrong in the order, but I think to the point that everybody said, it's great to be back at Imola. We didn't have a race there for quite a while. It came back because of COVID and not being able to go to all the tracks, right? So it's good that we're still there. Iconic track, if for those that have been following the sport, if they hear someone mention Tamburello, that it's one of the corners that for so long has been changed and edited, and there's obviously been tragedy there as well. But it's amazing seeing. I don't think we're going to see a lot of new tracks around the world where there's an iconic picture of somebody eating food in a house with a Ferrari, literally outside. So I'm looking forward to the race. I think we're going to see more and more issues similar to what we've seen with reliability. We're seeing teams pushing cars maybe beyond the limits. I don't see that as slowing down. Some of the teams are struggling a little bit. Probably I shouldn't say struggling, but there's changes with the fuel, right? Going from 5%, synthetic fuel to 10. It's changing fuel systems and the way the cars work, and we're seeing that play out. I'm confident we're seeing, Mercedes get on top of the car. Hard to go past Ferrari at a home race. The track is named from the Ferrari family, and they're doing so well. But I just can't wait to see the race. Hopefully the safety car, the AMG safety car, is there this weekend.
I think I know both you boys are Mercedes fans, and it seems that the AMG safety car brings a bit of better luck than the Aston one. So I shan't tempt fate, but a pleasure talking to you guys. And I think for those tuned in and listening, there'll be many more of these to come through the year, and we can delve deeper into almost any avenue of motor racing and Formula One. But also for myself, I want to come back to the table next time with some tales from the archive as I learn more about the world of security and understand, Mike, you reference your lifetime in cybersecurity. George, we know your history and heritage within it, and I want to come up with some of the big stories of the past, your memories and moments, and I'd love for our listeners to get their questions in on that. In the meantime, enjoy Imola. Next time we speak, we'll be post-Miami, I guess. We'll know more from that as well, but it's been a joy, guys.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think when you look at this podcast, right, this is the first of many that we can do together and plan to do. And the question is, why are we doing it? Well, we think it's a lot of fun, and as I said earlier, combining racing and speed and technology together, we think it all makes sense. And I think a big part too is this is the first one, right? We want to get feedback. We'll get comments on it. We'll figure out what topics people want to talk about, both racing and technology and security. And really, it's kind of open forum. We'll have some other guests on here, maybe some drivers, some engineers, some folks in security, and we'll just make it a kind of an informal affair that we can chat about things that we're really passionate about and love. And I think a big part of it is to get the feedback and the comments, just to see where this goes over time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, guys. We'll be back with the next one very soon with new F1 information and the latest from the world of cybersecurity. Thanks for tuning in.